Hi everyone, and welcome to this lesson today, which will look at security in the war on terror. My name is Shereen Fernandez, and I'm a lecturer in human geography at Queen Mary University. So my research looks at the geographies of securities with a particular focus on how securitizing measures post 9/11 shapes Muslim identities. So I'm interested in how these measures are embedded in our everyday settings, in particular how they are embedded in schools. So in this lesson today, we will be looking at three key things. Firstly, we will discuss what the war on terror is and why it has been described as exceptional. We will then move on to thinking about how the war on terror has led to an increase in policing and securitization, and finally, how racialized groups, particularly those racialized as Muslim, are viewed as security threats. So let's begin by thinking about what the war on terror is. Well, the war on terror was a response to the attacks on September 11, 2001, which is often shortened to 9/11, where 4 commercial airplanes were hijacked and crashed into key landmarks, including the World Trade Center in New York. And the World Trade Center is the building that you can see in the headline in the front page of the Daily Telegraph newspaper on the slides. So the group Al-Qaeda, they took responsibility for the attacks after it was declared by its leader, bin Laden. Now, this was not the first time that a terrorist attack took place in the US, and that's really important to emphasize. So in 1993, a truck bomb detonated in the underground car park of the World Trade Center, which killed 6 people. And in 1995, a government building in Oklahoma City was also bombed by somebody called Timothy McVeigh, who allegedly expressed anti-government sentiments. And it was in that attack that over 150 people were killed that day. Now, the key difference, however, with 9/11 and these other terrorist attacks was the scale of the destruction that took place, with over 2,000 people dying that day, and the symbolism that it represented. So the attacks of 9/11 came to be known as a destruction of freedom, of liberal values, of democracy, and so forth. And the narrative around the war on terror was framed in that way. Now, the president at the time of the attacks was George W. Bush. And at the time, he labeled these attacks as a form of terrorism. Now, in the days after the attacks, the Bush administration, which is the term given to describe the government at the time, declared a state of emergency to reflect the seriousness of the situation. Now, a state of emergency is declared to reflect, the seriousness of the situation, that there is a crisis going on, but also in effect suspends normative laws and grants permissions for governments to use extraordinary measures to manage situations. So if we think about, for example, the COVID situation in the UK and across the world, the UK government declared lockdowns, they declared various forms of restrictions, or because of a state of emergency, which was the COVID pandemic. So emergency measures are used to deal with an ongoing crisis. And that, in essence, is what happened with the war on terror. On terror, these exceptional measures and responses spiraled globally. Now, even though the attacks on 9/11 only were confined to the United States, the war on terror was felt globally. It was experienced globally. And what we mean by this is that the US, for example, they invaded and attacked Afghanistan and Iraq on the grounds of fighting terrorism. Now, many other countries across the world, particularly the UK, showed allegiance to the US and showed their support that they would also join the US in this fight against terrorism. And so we can see how this idea of countering terrorism became a global ambition. Now, the Bush administration, when they invaded Iraq, they claimed that they were doing so on the grounds of finding weapons of mass destruction, and this was later disproven. Now, some of the other exceptional measures to exist within the war on terror was this idea of indefinite detention of those suspected of terrorism in prison sites, such as Guantanamo Bay. So, for example, if you were accused of being a terrorist or had, for example, links to a terrorist organization, you would have been imprisoned in a site or a black site or a detention facility such as Guantanamo Bay, in which your civil liberties, so your rights, your legal protections and so forth are suspended. Now, when the US launched its offensive in Afghanistan, several Muslim men were captured in and around the country, and they were sent to various prisons. So this includes Guantanamo, this includes Bagram, and in particular in Iraq, it was exposed that prisoners were subjected to torture by US soldiers in a prison facility known as Abu Ghraib. Although the US, the Bush administration, they condemned these forms of torture and abuse, and they said that it was not befitting of the US Army or the US in general, it was difficult to distance themselves from the practices of torture, especially when the government at the time legislated for such extreme measures to be used. So, for example, in one case, it was permitted to waterboard detainees and individuals who are held in these sites, which is a form of drowning, is a form of torture because it stimulates this idea that a person is drowning, in effect, to get them to confess to certain allegations and so forth. Now, it's also really important to emphasize that any sort of admission made under forms of torture or abuse can never be used in a court of law because of the circumstances in which these allegations were made. And another really, really important point to remember is that detainees who are imprisoned in sites such as Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and so forth, they are stripped of their legal rights and entitlements because they are not considered as prisoners of war. They are not considered as prisoners, but rather they are considered as enemy combatants. Now, this allowed for them to be treated inhumanely and restricted their access to the courts of law. So as the war on terror expanded, so too did the methods of torture, the methods of abuse, and the methods of securitization change and expand by the US. So when Barack Obama came into power in 2008, he made many commitments, including the closure of Guantanamo Bay. So at its peak, there are around 900 or so detainees who were captured by the US, and currently there is only a handful or so of men who are still detained, and getting them released is actually quite logistically difficult. And the reason why they have remained in prison facilities such as Guantanamo Bay is because the US does not want them on their soil, in their country, because then they would have to be tried in their courts. And so there's very difficult bureaucratic procedures associated with releasing prisoners. So during the war on terror, the use of drones became widespread in countries such as Yemen and Somalia, which were drafted and included in this war on terror. Now, because terrorism is such a wide-ranged concept, it is constantly changing the definitions of what is a terrorist, what is terrorism. It's a political tool. It changes depending on who is declaring what it is, what country, and so forth. There really is no official end to this idea of the war on terror. And we've seen this with the way in which drones have been used. Now, drones are novel to the war on terror because they do not require soldiers to be present physically in the battlefield. Rather, they work more like video games, or a controller is based in the US and can basically operate from the US to shoot and kill targets as far as places such as Afghanistan and so forth. They are considered to be deadly machines, and essentially they are, described as killing machines as well. Now, drone warfare contravenes the rule of law in many ways, but one of the main ways it does so is that it does not allow an individual to be tried for their alleged crimes. It does not give them access to courts, to legal procedures, and whatever. Rather, it just kills them on the spot. And in Yemen, these drone strikes in particular have indiscriminately targeted children and civilians. And there have been a large number of children who have also been caught up in this expanding war on terror. Now, one of the ways in which the war on terror morphed is that it also came home. And what we mean by this is that the war on terror was not just confined to faraway lands, but it was also experienced acutely in the UK and the US and so forth. So it came back to the West, it came back to Western countries. It was not just fought in the global South. Now, in the UK, the 7th of July bombings in 2005 prompted the UK government to take seriously the threat that terrorism could be brought back home. Now, this process is often referred to as blowback and describes a situation where the violence experienced elsewhere comes back to the domestic sphere. The government argued that individuals were becoming radicalized and were being encouraged to join terrorist organizations and groups. And over the years, the terrorist threat has transformed and attention shifted from groups such as Al-Qaeda to ISIS, who carried out a string of attacks in the UK. Now, as a way to manage this threat of terrorism in the domestic sphere, the UK government launched what is known as the Prevent strategy, but it became later known as the Prevent duty. Now, Prevent was launched in 2003 under the leadership of Tony Blair, but since then has changed in its nature and scope. So initially in 2003, when it was launched, the government was really interested with this idea about community cohesion, so working with communities to alleviate this idea of terrorism. The logic was that if we work with Muslim communities in particular, we will be able to prevent further attacks from happening and so on. Now, this led to a number of organisations and charities being funded by the UK government under this remit of counter-terrorism, and bearing in mind that especially in 2008, when the recession occurred, a lot of these organisations were cash-strapped, they had no money, and often had to turn to these alternative forms of finance. But what happened is that Muslim communities, Muslim groups, young Muslims became very suspicious of these organizations because of their associations with government counterterrorism industries. Now, in 2015, the Prevent strategy became known as the Prevent duty, and there was a radical shake-up to this counter-extremism program. So in 2015, the Prevent duty became a statutory duty in schools, in public institutions, such as schools, healthcare settings, universities, and so on. And what this means is that those people who are working within these settings must now abide by this policy. Now, it's really, really important as well to keep in mind that although Prevent requires individuals to refer people on to this program for alleged extremism or radicalization, the definition of extremism is actually quite vague, and it's not very easily identifiable what it is. So the UK government defined extremism as active or vocal opposition to British values, and you can see what these values are in the current slide. And you may be aware of British values, as these are now also required to be promoted in schools and colleges, and there seems to be a suggestion through both policies that if you promote British values, you are less likely to become an extremist or terrorist. So we're starting to see now the way in which extremism, terrorism, and so on is becoming closely associated with this idea of nationalism, and this idea of that particular groups and communities are more susceptible to this idea of extremism. So we've spoken a little bit about how Prevent came about, but now I really want to think a little bit further about how Prevent works. So Prevent, as I've said, is the counter-extremism measure used by the UK government to refer those they believe who are susceptible to this idea of extremism and radicalization onto their program to de-radicalize them so that they do not commit acts of terrorism. Now, it's really important to note that the UK is, this is the flagship program of the UK, and globally, now many different countries are trying to adopt a program similar to Prevent. So France, for example, the US, and so forth. So how does it work? So Prevent relies on those working in the public sector to refer individuals. So, for example, a teacher may refer a student that they are teaching because they have said something to suggest that they may be at risk to extremism. So we're going to unpack this further in the next few slides. But for example, this can constitute a child declaring or saying something that has happened at home. It could be a passing conversation with their friend or so forth that has been picked up and overheard by a teacher and is referred to Prevent. Now, the referral is assessed by the police and the local authority, who decide if the case needs to be escalated. So if an individual is believed to need further support, they will be referred onto the de-radicalisation programme known as Channel. Now, a large percentage of those who get referred do not end up in Channel, but that does not mean that the consequences of a referral is no longer felt. Now, when thinking about what PREVENT is, these three words are often used to describe it. So PREVENT is described as operating in the pre-criminal space and is a preemptive measure, which means that it is viewed as being separate to any measure in the criminal justice system. So in effect, this means that criticisms of PREVENT as a form of policing are stifled because it is said that PREVENT exists outside of this realm of policing, of criminal justice, and the criminal justice industry and so forth. Now, this is further bolstered by claims that PREVENT is a form of safeguarding designed to protect individuals rather than stigmatize. So, for example, if you see that, a lot, as we're going to see in the next few slides, a large number of Muslim children have been referred onto PREVENT, and it will often be said that they have been safeguarded from harms and abuse and so on related to extremism and radicalization. Now, a really important point to keep in mind is that PREVENT is about ideologically challenging individuals, which means that certain beliefs and practices will be considered as forms of extremism. Some have been flagged for talking about religious practices, whereas others have been referred for wearing items of clothing which have raised concerns that they could be at risk to extremism and so on. Now, PREVENT describes itself as tackling all forms of extremism and terrorism, primarily Islamist and far-right terrorism. But since its inception, so since it began, the focus has been on those racialized as Muslim. Now, it's difficult to untangle the association between extremism, terrorism, and Islam because how ingrained it has become in policy and public discourse. So as we saw in the earlier slides where we spoke about the war on terror and how it led to invasions and occupations in Iraq, in Afghanistan, drone strikes in Yemen, these are predominantly Muslim countries. These are predominantly Muslim spaces, and the detention of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib and so forth. These were Muslim men who were being rounded up, and so we can see the way in which the war on terror, especially in the earliest of times, was being associated with this idea that Muslims in particular were committing acts of terror, and this has still permeated the discourse around counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. So I now want to focus on this idea of what preemptive security is and what it means. And this is really important as we're unpacking today this idea of how securitization has led to an increase of insecurity by those who are racialized as Muslim. Now, preemptive policing and preemptive security measures is based on two ideas. Firstly, that crimes can be intercepted before they happen. And secondly, it is that it relies on this idea that we need to rely on our gut instincts, on suspicion and so forth to dictate who may be a criminal. Now, this suspicion is intimately connected to race and class and projections of crime. So, for example, that certain crimes are likely to be committed by certain groups. So in Adam's previous video, for example, he spoke about sus laws, which derives from this idea of suspicion and preemptive policing that allowed the police to stop and search those that they believed were going to commit a crime. And this led to an increase in suspicion in the targeting of young Black men in Britain by police, some of which we still see today, despite the sus laws being revoked. Now, PREVENT operates on similar logics, that people can use their gut instincts to identify those that they believe are susceptible to extremism and radicalization, before they commit an act of terror. Now, because of the way that extremism, terrorism, and radicalization have been described in the media and the policy as largely a Muslim problem, as we've outlined in the previous slides, teachers, doctors, and so forth who are required to implement PREVENT are more likely to refer those who are Muslim onto its program. Now, again, I just want to emphasize that PREVENT will claim that it is about all forms of terrorism and extremism, primarily focusing on Islamist and far-right ideologies. However, not only are the referral experiences not the same, but the signs of extremism related to both forms of terrorism and extremism they vary greatly. So research that I've conducted, as well as an academic colleagues, such as Tarek Yunus, who has worked on Prevent in the NHS, indicates that normative beliefs and practices associated with Islam will tend to be referred onto Prevent because they are misconstrued as signs of extremism. So, for example, we've had interviews where participants have spoken about how the fact that they were praying or asking to pray in certain spaces, or fasting or questioning Prevent, has led to them being referred onto its program or being referred to a manager and so on. So here are some examples of how Prevent has targeted individuals. Now, these are some of the effects of what it feels like to be referred. So in one of the newspaper articles, it says that my son was terrified and how Prevent alienates UK Muslims. So it really excludes them from public life. And there's been a number of reports, a number of papers and research which has been done looking at the impact of this measure on Muslims in spaces such as the NHS, schools, universities, and so forth, where a large number of Muslim groups and students have come out to say that they feel like their expressions, what they can say, is being limited because of this, because of the way in which Prevent operates. So here are some of examples of how Prevent. Oh no, that's the wrong one. Sorry. So one of the most prominent effects of counter-extremism measures is the rise in Islamophobia in society. So here is an example of how mainstream media exacerbates Islamophobia, and these are all intimately connected to how Muslims have been constructed as security threats. So we can see here we have 3 examples from 3 different newspapers. One claiming that 1 in 5 British Muslims have sympathy for jihadis, others saying that Muslims tell British to go to hell, and the third that millions are eating halal food without knowing it. Now, all of these headlines, they play into a narrative that Muslims cannot be included into the British state, for example, that they exist outside of the nation state, that they are security threats, that they cannot integrate, and so forth. And it problematizes Muslim communities not just as extremists and terrorists, but says that they cannot really live side by side with others in our society. Now, especially after Brexit in particular, we've seen the rise in Islamophobia, this idea that those who visibly look Muslim are being attacked. Even if you are not Muslim, if you are just brown, for example, if you're Black or whatever, if you look like you are Muslim, you could be attacked in our everyday spaces. So we are seeing the way in which our spaces are being constructed as sites of insecurity because of policy discourse, because of these measures such as Prevent, which are playing on this narrative that Muslims are susceptible to certain forms of violence. So thinking about this a bit further now, I want to just spend the next 2 slides thinking about how counter-extremism and security have become an everyday feature. Now, as I said in the previous slide, so those racialized as Muslims, those who look Muslim, may experience public life in a very different way because of counter-extremism measures, because of counter-terrorism measures. And we can see that, especially in the UK, especially in London in particular, where my research has been conducted, we can see that spaces, public spaces, such as transport, tube stations, airports, shops, and so forth, are encouraging Londoners to become the eyes and ears of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism. So if many of you have taken a train, for example, you may be aware of the See It, Say It Sorted campaign, which encourages those travellers and commuters to report for signs against, to report an individual if they believe they are looking, if they look suspicious, if they look risky. So it could be that they are wearing a bag, or they are looking quite shiftily around the place, for example. So Londoners are being encouraged to report these individuals onto police, and so on. Now, again, it's really important to remember that these ideas, the suspicion is rooted in this understanding that crime, that terrorism, that extremism is intimately connected to forms, to particular racial groups. and so on. So we cannot separate then this idea of securitisation, counter-extremism, counter-terrorism from the way in which crime has been racialised. Now, one of the key examples that many Muslims and those racialised as Muslims will speak about is their experiences in the airport. So the way they are treated differently, for example, they are taken away for extra security, they are scrutinised further, and so on, shows how simple activities such as travelling are made to feel much harder for Muslims because of these counter-extremism, counter-terrorism measures. And to wrap this all up, and to just come back to this idea of how how counter-extremism, how security has become an everyday feature, I really want to emphasize this idea that counter-extremism really does rely on visualizing security threats. So this idea that you can see the threat, you can see potential signs of extremism and risks and so forth. And so we really are, as everyday citizens, as individuals and so on, we are being drafted into the front lines of the so-called war on terror, that we are now expected to, report individuals that we believe are going to be susceptible to extremism, that we believe could commit acts of terror and so forth, which shows the way in which the war on terror is coming home. So again, as you go into different shops, as you travel by train, by bus, by plane, and so forth, you're going to now become more attuned to the way in which you are being asked to be part of the war on terror, so to speak, or be part of counter-terrorism efforts. This idea that it is not just the state's responsibility, but it is an everyday responsibility for everyone.